Okay, welcome online everyone to our webinar on managing tree hazards. Really pleased that I've got Rory McKenzie and John Towt from DELP here, who were instrumental in the national group that put the doctrine together. The doctrine was based largely on the work done at DELP, so it's great that they're able to present to us today. And then we'll hear from Peter Leeson from Queensland Parks and Wildlife Services, who's got a really interesting case study around the use of the hazardous tree guidelines. So having said that, I will just hand over to John. I think he's going to kick off on behalf of DELP.
Thanks, Deb. John Towt here, everybody. Just a quick point of order, Deb. Do I click the Start Slides button, or is it just running normally?
No, you should just be able to click the arrows to go forward and back.
Okay, excellent. Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. So, in putting together this presentation, we sort of had to start back at the start. So, how did Victoria originally come up with the system that it had prior to the national standard? So, I'll cover a bit off on that, and then we'll venture into where we are now with the national guideline, and then what it means for going into the future. So where we've been, and when I say we, I mean Victoria, we had a rapidly evolving system of work. Largely through the 2000s, people sort of knew of what was best practice and applied it in various levels of certainty, depending on the situation and how they felt on the day, as one senior forester calls it. And it wasn't until the late 2000s that the system of work was actually implemented into the fire management manuals for the department in Victoria. We had a number of successive tree strikes through planned burning and other things like that during that decade, and the resulting workplace investigations provided the catalyst to ask ourselves the question, what work do we do for a planned activity before we introduce fire? Because a lot of the tree strikes weren't very big trees. They were, single pole, dead pole trees or 20-year-old juvenile trees that would burn through within an hour. So that's what led Victoria to start implementing the before fire system of work. So the protection assured and protection not assured classes of the trees. We had some large fire seasons, being 2003, 2006 and 2009, with a high rate of tree fall incidents in there as well. And we had the Canberra firefighter that was tragically killed in 2009 by the falling limb down near around Marysville. And that again, I think that 2009 incident was what really spurred us to say we better start cementing an agreed system into our manuals and into our training. So around 2009, 2010, we had a documented two-tier system, and by two-tier I mean before fire and after fire. So the preventative works of hazardous trees before fire, and then identifying clear and present danger trees after fire. We produced a pictorial guide for crews and field people to use in determining and understanding how the system of work was applied or should be applied into those circumstances. 2013, I'm sure this is of no news, we had 2 fatalities in Harrietville, Steve Kadar and Katie Peters. The subsequent coronial inquest provided an external insight into what more work had to be done. The coroner made 10 recommendations and 4 suggestions, and the government of the day said, we will adopt all of them. And the things of note were suggestions 1 and 2, which was a need for better training, both in the awareness, so everyone actually is trained on the system of work with a fair bit of detail, and training, equipping people to actually become tree hazard assessors, not simply relying on their experience or their exposure to get them through. Another recommendation of note was the need for other means of protection from falling trees. So for the department, that meant implementing falling object protection, or FOPs, onto our ultralight fleet and our tanker fleet. And another point of note was a need for a common approach across all national agencies, which was recommendation 5. And that's what led into the literature review being undertaken, and that led on into the RLM group meeting and discussing where to with a national guideline. So where are we now? 2015, a joint standard operating procedure was introduced called Tree Hazard Management Bushfire Response. It was largely based upon the DELP and CFA tree system, or hazard tree system, that was first documented in 2010, with some additional things in there about other agencies, being MFB and other response and support agencies. 2015, the coroner recommendations came down and the government accepted the recommendations and suggestions. 2017, the National Literature Review was undertaken for tree hazard management systems. Another part in 2017, or at roughly the same time, the Rural Land Management Council met, a tree hazard subcommittee was formed and started work on the national guideline. In 2017, DELP completed implementation of all of the recommendations and suggestions. And 2019, we've got endorsement of the national guideline for tree hazards. So that sort of brings us up to speed with what's happened in the last near 20 years for both Victoria and largely the country in more recent years. So the intent of the guideline is primarily focused around safety, and it provides a uniformed approach to developing agency doctrine. It's not going to tell you what your documentation should look like and what products you should have. It's up for agencies to determine how far down and what it provides for its staff and members in terms of understanding and implementing a consistent, safe system of work for managing tree hazards. So it's a common approach. It's aimed at increased resource sharing. So the next time we have a massive fire in Tasmania and there's 8 fire agencies working on a single sector, we can all be sure that we're all talking about the same hazards or same classes of tree hazards and talking about the same mitigations and the same marking symbology and all those sorts of things. So it supports interoperability. It also meets our OHS and work health safety responsibilities when deploying our staff into these areas, because we have a standardised system for identifying and mitigating risks. So key features of the guideline are obviously the safe system of work, so it's managing tree hazards consistently. And when I say managing tree hazards, we all understand about agreeing when we talk about tree having a risk, we can talk about now with the right language and say the risk of this tree falling over in this time frame and in this area. And those things are important because we need to be able to say, if it falls in this area, this is who it will potentially impact. And if it falls in this time, this is the time that we are expecting to have people working in the area, whether it be blacking out or patrolling or doing asset protection or all those sorts of things. We're all talking about the same thing now. The tree hazard classes. So why is a tree deemed a hazard or a potential hazard? So the 3 classes of tree hazards, so protection assured, protection not assured, and both of those classes are before fire or in a planned activity. And then the clear and present danger tree, which is a hazardous, a killer tree essentially, that you find at the point where you believe it will fall down or will collapse during the time frame of operation, so the time that you're expecting people or assets to be in the area where it's going to fall down. Marking symbology, so how do I communicate the hazard to everyone else? So we have a national standard for marking symbology. It's a completely new system that we haven't taken one state's system and pushed it out to everyone else. It's a completely new system. There might be 1 or 2 marks in there that were used for other tree hazard classes in some states. We've ratified the symbology and everyone agrees that it makes sense and it's clear and it doesn't confuse other industries or what they use to mark trees. and the treatment options. What can we realistically do about tree hazards, and what are the trade-offs around, say, hand-falling a tree that might be a killer tree versus just putting an exclusion zone up around it and leaving it fall on its own accord. So when we talk about a standardised system, we talk about the before fire and the after fire. Another way to look at it is to say what is known. So when for Victoria we had a lot of those burning tree strikes, one of the things that became apparent to us was, hey, burning is a planned activity and we have control over when and how that planned activity is undertaken. So one of the things that was put to us was, if you have control over the when and the how and who will be there, why don't you go through and, the forest estate was saying, yeah, it's pretty easy to determine which trees are likely to fall down versus which trees aren't when you put fire into the environment. So ask yourself these questions. Who's going to be exposed? What will they be doing? When will they be doing it? What are the hazards? And why will they be there? And so those are the first obvious questions that you can ask yourself for the planned aspect, or what is known aspect, for the tree hazard system of work. So for planned burning, firefighters will be there. They'll be doing ignition and patrol. They might be there for 1 to 3 days across a number of shifts. Where are the hazards? We can largely pre-identify most of the hazards. We can't say we'll get all of them because we can never really truly get all of them, but we can get a vast majority. And while they be there doing the work, it's part of our responsibility for fire management on public land or land. And the National Work Health and Safety Guideline, or the Code of Practice, talks about who has a responsibility for managing work health and safety risks. And I've just copied that out of the Code of Practice. And these two parts here require persons who have a duty to ensure health and safety to manage by eliminating health and safety risks so far as reasonably practical, or to minimise those risks as far as reasonably practical. So by saying we can never really truly know exactly what trees will fall down and what direction they'll fall and all that sort of business, we can largely look at a tree, assess its condition and say, this tree is unlikely to be able to protect it from fire, so we're going to remove it before we put fire into the environment. Or we're likely to be able to protect this tree from fire by doing some mitigation works beforehand. We might clear the fuel away from the base. We might use foam prior to ignition to wet it down to decrease the chances of ignition. Those are the most common treatments for the trees before fire. And then we have, obviously, the during fire or after fire. So what is unknown? So this is typically around the fire or storm response. Who will be exposed? Responders, potentially some public. What will they be doing? They'll be doing fire suppression or stabilisation. Stabilisation, obviously, if it's a storm response. When will they be doing it? We're not quite sure. Where are they going to be doing it? We don't know that either. And where are the hazards? We don't really know. We can model likelihood, but we won't be able to model likelihood down to the tactical level. We won't be able to tell you, within 10 square metres, this tree or trees in this 10 square metres will definitely fall over. When I say we can model it, Victoria has a model for high and very high tree hazard, which is largely supported by fire intensity across forest types and being able to map, vast areas of forest that have had very high or extreme fire behaviour through them and killed a lot of trees. So it's typically mountain ash and alpine ash down into the mixed species forests. We can largely determine and say there is a high frequency of dead trees in this area. If another fire starts, you are likely to see a high amount of tree fall. But that's a modelled bit of guidance. It's also supported by air obs and by ground observations. Ground observations might get there and say, actually, although it was modelled, we've got here and the tree has quite diminished for a number of reasons. There's already been a high rate of tree fall, or the area's been salvage logged, or another reason. So when we start talking about both a planned activity and a response activity, so before fire and after fire, we have to start thinking about what's the work area. And by work area, I mean, where are we actively deploying and planning to deploy people and targets to? When I say targets, I mean people, vehicles, plant. If a tree is going to hit something, that's a target. So what area will the targets be working in? What trees will the targets be exposed to? Are they going to be exposed to big dead alpine ash? Are they going to be exposed to regen? Are they going to be exposed to, just standard, a standard forest type? All forests have some level of hazard, some more than others. What are the external factors that can contribute to trees and limbs falling? So by external factors, I mean all these things on the right here. So strong gusty winds, impact by plant or heavy machinery, erosions or landslips, exposure to fire, heavy rainfall. Heavy rainfall basically contributes to saturated roots. We talk about the external targets affecting trees. We know trees can fall over on their own. We know that when you introduce an external factor, the likelihood of trees falling increases. And that depends largely on the characteristics or the individual features of a single tree. And it leads us down to the bottom question: how can we reduce the risk of tree fall occurring? So in understanding the work area in the unknown, we have to ask ourselves the question: where is the fire edge now? Where will the fire edge be in 12 to 24 hours? Where will we deploy people and vehicles to? What trees will the targets being people and plant and vehicles, be exposed to, and how can we protect against the risk of tree fall? This photo you see on your right is in lower central Victoria. If you can see well, there's a lot of fire kills. This is mixed species forest through here, just getting under some ash. Fire killed mixed species from 2009. There's a fire tower up here. The road to the fire tower sort of runs atop of this spur. So while we knew the fire was in here, that would largely be the work area. We had to build access to the fire area first, which meant pushing past a lot of large dead trees with D6s, D7s, and thinking about what the exposure of that earth-moving equipment would have on the root structures of these trees. And so that was our work area, both the fire area and the access track we were building to get there. And then we talk about assessing the risk. So I talked about looking at the characteristics of a tree that make it more hazardous or likely to fall. So we look at trees and we start thinking about things like hung up branches. Has it got widow makers in it? Does it have any cracks or twists in the trunk or the branches? Cracks or twists that are likely to be a weak point if the tree was to come under any external pressure or any pressure from external influences rather. Does it have exposed roots? Has there been evidence of root pull or root surge in the past? Does it have a dead crown or dead trees in or around it? Is the tree itself dead? Hollows and defects in the main trunk. Has there been limb tear that's exposed now a weak point in the main structure that again becomes a weak point if external pressure comes onto the tree? Has it got insect or fungal infestation that's likely to reduce the health of the tree and make it more susceptible to failing? Or is it partially hung up in something else? So those are the characteristics, and then we think about the external influences. So, largely it's going to be around things like fire. What's the fire behaviour going to be when it gets to this tree? Is it going to impact the tree? Is the tree going to catch on fire? What can we do about it with what we've got now? So how can we mitigate the risk? This Venn diagram we use in Victoria to try and explain to a lot of people who are new to the tree hazard space, understanding the risk and consequence and the interactions of all three. Where will the tree impact? A near miss is just as undesirable as an incident. So if you imagine that we have our tree here, I'll turn the dot on again. We have our tree here with various amounts of characteristics. So widowmakers, hollows, all things like that. Then we have our targets, so our firefighters, our equipment, our responders. And then we have, and this relationship here would just be a standard day in the forest. You might be, we've all been out in the forest on a good day and going, yep, I'm feeling pretty comfortable. If you go out in the forest when it's blowing 40 k's from the north or the south or just 40 k's in general, you might be feeling a bit more edgy. You might be thinking about not being there altogether and introduce some other things and you'd be like, nah, this is not a good place to be. When we talk about introducing fire into that equation, that's an external influence. So now we've got fire interacting with the tree and we've decided we're going to be there to try and put the fire out. We've now got three things that equal exposure to a hazard and quite a significant risk. If we look to remove one of these circles, we've gone some way in addressing the risk. We can remove the tree. We can simply push the tree down, tree's on the ground, problem solved. We've still got fire, we've still got wind, things like that. If we remove ourselves, we remove the target, then we've simply got trees on fire. And if the tree falls, it's not going to hit anyone or anything. Or if we remove the influence, if we remove the fire or we stop the fire from getting into trees, then we go back to just being, a forest with trees of particular hazard and particular characteristics without any external influence. Obviously, we can't stop the wind. We can do some things to stop plant impacting trees that we don't want impacted, but largely we can't do much about taking fire out of large parts of the environment to limit tree hazard. What we talk about with this part about removing fire is protecting trees before they catch on fire. So when we talk about determining mitigation or treatment before fire, we've got three choices. We can either do some protective work, so this is the potential killer tree or potential clear and present danger tree protection assured, and we might look at this tree here and say, yep, that's quite a significant hollow. If I were to get into this hollow, this tree would likely catch on fire, and once it was on fire and fully involved, it's going to fall down in a matter of time. But we can do some protective work and we can clear around it. And by clearing around it, we are fairly certain we're going to keep fire out of it. Now, just clearing around a tree like that on its own isn't enough. It needs to be supported, and I talk about the three-pronged approach to protecting trees. You need to have good preventative work by clearing around trees sufficiently. You need to have an educated lighting crew that can identify trees that have been protected and say, I'm going to pull up my drip torch, or I'm just going to dot around this tree and not put a massive line of fire through it. I'm going to reduce the fire behaviour around this tree. And you need to have a good patrol crew. So if they see fire potentially starting to impact a tree that needs to be protected, they can get onto it and they can extinguish it, or they can foam it, or do something else to give it a bit more protection. But one thing on its own is likely not going to be enough. We could get a dozer in there and push the tree down so we can remove the tree altogether. The problem with removing a tree altogether is likely, especially when you've got a forest where the trees are fairly close to each other, you'll likely just create other hazards. By other hazards, I mean you just create another widowmaker. And then you go and push that tree down, that creates another widowmaker, or another two. And how far do you go pushing trees over before you say we've made this area safe? So that needs to be considered also. And then we could do nothing. By nothing, I mean two things. We could choose not to do any mitigation work, but if we choose to put people into that area or into the work area where these trees are, then we really haven't answered the question of, have we made this a low-risk workspace? The other thing to do with nothing is to say, there are too many trees in here for us to treat beforehand. We're not going to put people in there. We're going to choose the next ridge over, or we're going to move the work area somewhere else. So that could also be something that you do. So prior to the national guideline being ratified, this is how the different states identified a killer tree. So in Western Australia, I'm pretty sure in understanding their system, they use red and white tape to indicate an area where there is a killer tree present. In South Australia, Victoria, Queensland and Canberra, the symbology is a big yellow K sprayed on the tree, followed up with an exclusion zone around the tree. In New South Wales and Tasmania, it's a circle with a slash through it, and that's the symbology for a killer tree. The one-tier and the two-tier colours simply refer to, does the agency or state simply mark killer trees after fire? Is that the entirety of their system of work? Or do they adopt the before fire system of work, being the dot and the cross for Victoria? Most of the time that's consistent across South Australia, Victoria and Queensland. So they have the two before fire marks, and then the after fire clear and present danger mark. That's what the 1-tier and the 2-tier system refer to. So that's before the national standard. The symbology that the working group decided upon, I'm sure you've seen it, is the following. So the clear and present danger tree is now a circle with a cross through it, as you can see on the top there. We've also included an indicator tree, because we recognise that in some forest types, in some areas, there might be a killer tree, but you physically can't get to it, or it's not safe to get to it to mark that it's a killer tree. So how do we tell crews that there's a killer tree nearby, and they need to be aware of it? So using the indicator tree, and it can be used for either a clear and present danger tree or a tree that needs to be removed before fire, with an arrow and the rough distance or the estimated distance to that tree. So in this situation here, we've got a tree that's being used as an indicator tree with the new marking for clear and present danger, 10 metres and an arrow. So someone should be able to pull up and say, 10 metres that direction, there's a killer tree. That's the role of an indicator tree. We have trees with hangers. Now, trees with hangers is an interesting point. Why don't we use H for hangers? Well, H for hangers in Victoria means habitat trees, and that largely gets confused. And the point being, a tree with a hanger is just as likely to hurt you or kill you as a tree that's going to fall over completely out of the ground. So we can't mix our words with what hangers or the potential that hangers can have on a person or a target. It doesn't mean we need to push the tree down. It means we've got a little bit of breathing room with how we treat that tree. The exclusion zone for a tree with a hanger doesn't need to be 2 tree lengths. It could be, as a standard, but you might decide as an assessor to look at the tree and say, the hanger's going to fall here. All I need to do is exclude the impact area. So that's what that mark is. So the mark for killer tree and a hanger is the circle with a cross and an arrow above and I emphasise above the mark, pointing to the rough direction of the hanger, and it's in the tree that the mark is on, not in the tree adjacent or the couple of trees over there, the tree on it. The protection not assured mark with the arrow, we decided to put in there because in some parts of the state they do have the ability to remove hangers. You might have an excavator out doing some burn prep work, and they may be able to dislodge the hanger or knock it down. You might be able to reach it with a pole saw. You've effectively removed the characteristic of that tree that made it a hazard, as in you've brought the hanger or the widowmaker down. But if you can't, then you need to treat it as removing the whole tree or calling it a killer tree and excluding that area. But that's what that symbol there with the arrow means. It's up to states whether they want to endorse or use that symbology or not. We put it there as, if you want to, this is how you do it. If not, that's fine. I can understand why people would not want to use it and just be really clear about things. The barrier tape that was specified to be used is the yellow and black marking tape. It can be yellow and black, it doesn't need to say anything. This one here says caution, do not enter, but yellow and black. We talked about the need to separate out hazard tapes so we can be really sure about what's just a general fireground hazard or, don't go here versus what's a tree hazard that we really don't want you to go near. Because inevitably, if you're responding to an incident and you see tape up, your immediate reaction is, that tape's for someone else, that's for the public, that's not for me. And I've seen it time and time again where people, because they're in a car with flashing lights and they've got a helmet on, they drive through tape because I'm safe, I'm wearing my PPE, that tape's not for me. The reason we stuck with and we emphasised the use for yellow and black was to be really clear, if you see yellow and black hazard tape, that is for tree hazard. your helmet will not protect you if a tree falls out of the ground and lands in that area. It will save you from small things hitting you in the head. It won't protect you from big things. If crews don't have yellow and black tape, we encourage them to use any tape or any means that they have to exclude an area. The preference is for yellow and black. No one's going to get too worked up if you have to use up a pallet full of red and white tape before you adopt yellow and black. Down the bottom here we have the potential killer tree protection assured, also known as a circle tree. So the circle represents clearing around the bottom of a tree. That's why we went with a circle. We also went with a circle because a circle, if for whatever reason the tree that you're trying to protect did become fully involved and did become a killer, it's easy to turn that circle into that mark there by putting a cross through it to say this tree is now compromised. Granted, you would hope that someone who would be able to see it and go, yep, I can see that tree is no longer protected, it's fully involved or it's become weaker, but it makes it very clear. So rather than trying to have to rub out something, spray it over something, it's very clear that it can go from a circle to a cross tree, if it's safe to do so. And then we have the potential killer tree protection not assured. These are the trees we want removed before the planned activity, before the planned burn. So a circle with a line through it saying, push this tree over, essentially, is what we're saying with that one. So where to from here? So the guideline has been endorsed by AFAC. We're hoping that the agencies will adopt the guideline and seek to develop their own internal doctrine based off the guideline. AFAC and the Rural Land Management Group will continue to, I hope, support the guideline and work with agencies around how and when and the challenges of developing doctrine and training and all those sorts of things. I know that for agencies there will be a lot of change. For some agencies there will be small amounts of change. And this leads on to the other thing. Now that we have a standardised system, resource sharing and lesson sharing will be so much easier amongst states. When Victoria developed the awareness training, we had a lot of interest from outside the state to use that training, primarily from the other states and agencies that were adopting the two-tiered system. And we gave it without question freely to anyone who wanted to use it, who it made sense to. So we're hoping that both the ability to share resources for training and documentation and field guides will be more beneficial, and the lessons sharing both before and after incidents. We don't really want to see lessons after incidents. We don't want incidents to happen, but all these lessons add up to a greater understanding, and potentially we need to review the guideline and say, look, this thing here isn't really working. We need to drop out the hanger indicator because people don't understand what it means and it's being used incorrectly. So that's sort of where we're hoping to go from here. Where we're going, we're hoping to go is one system of work. So rather than that map I showed before of different states with different markings, we've got one mark across the entire country that everyone understands and agrees to. And I think that's the end of my presentation.
And just to add, Rory McKenzie here from DELP, just to add to the direction from here. So there's a lot of, there's a wealth of knowledge in the AFAC guideline, and it is an embodiment of all the agencies and all the states coming together to really get that best knowledge around tree hazard management embodied in it. It was underpinned by that literature review, and a foundational piece of that literature review was looking at the safety incidents that have occurred with regards to tree hazard across all of Australia, and it really did identify this as one of the primary risks for firefighters and responders, almost outweighing the risk from burnover and fire itself. It really is important to look at this issue. So, and in that one of the key things that's embodied in the guideline as well is that agencies in their approach to recording tree hazard incidents really up the game in in building that as an incident type in your OHS or your WHS incident management system, so it can be reported, and that means that there might be a bit of a look at what each agency does to record those incidents. But that's really important to give us data going forward as well. So if you can record your tree hazard incidents, then you can sort of evaluate the effectiveness of the systems and procedures. So when we do come to review it, we can say, yeah, it's working, we're reducing the incidences of tree hazard, or no, it's not, and using that evidence base to inform, future enhancements and future developments, and maybe even, how we share lessons and resources into the future.
Okay, thanks Rory, and thanks John for that. I'll just quickly change these slides over so that Peter can then give you a little bit of a case study. Peter, over to you.
Okay, thanks Deb. You can hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So this is a case study that happened fairly recently, and it's intended to help illustrate the use of these guidelines. It happened last year at Yarimbula, which is just north of Bundaberg, between Bundaberg and Gladstone. Just a bit of background. The Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service had existing hazardous tree procedures. It was revised in 2016, and it included a whole lot of elements that are currently in the AFAC guidelines. It had these elements of this planning or pre-burn phase, of identifying what are fire lines, and the clearing of trees on those fire lines, including those smaller dead spars that were mentioned before, with pre-burn treatments. So prior to a burn occurring, you can do things like the raking. You can save significant trees. We also talked about burning under low Keach-Byram drought index KBDI conditions. For us, low is under 100. Over about 120, we've been noticing tree fall significantly increases. More of that heavy fuel catches on fire. We also think about using natural barriers rather than trying to contain fires on roads or fire lines, to reduce the need for blackout and containment. But obviously that doesn't happen everywhere, but it is one of the considerations to help avoid the need for blackout. During the ignition phase, the guidelines talked about cool edge ignition, and then close support to the igniter, both ahead of the igniter and behind the igniter. During the blackout phase, it talks about identifying those high-risk trees. That's not only the obvious trees with that are chimneying, but those small dead spars that can be smouldering at the base, and when they fall quiet and fast. Are these trees genuine risk or not? The trees might in fact be on a low risk side of the burn, and may not actually be a risk, although they might appear to be one. Can they be extinguished, or can they be pushed over with machinery? Can we just exclude the tree, and just keep patrolling and let it collapse, let it fall over? Or in fact, is this side of the fire low exposure? Does it really matter if it gets out and burns the next block, or if it does get out, can we come back in the morning? It's not going to go far and get around it. So that's that extended patrolling and watching. or can the area immediately adjacent to that tree be burnt out to put that tree within a safe perimeter? There was also discussion around what a spotter is, and it was really intended that the other crew member watch for those hazards behind the person doing the blackout. So keep an eye out for other trees that may not be observed, or hangers that may not have been observed. So there was the intention of the spotter in the guideline. So all this happened before the AFAC guidelines came out. We're currently in the process of reviewing our guidelines to align them with the AFAC guidelines. And since this incident, we're in the process of revising our guidelines to include learning outcomes from this incident. And one of those is that there has to be a clear instruction, a clear approval from the incident controller to hand fall any clear and present danger trees. A couple of the elements, statements within the procedure which are worth highlighting, and the first one is that these sorts of clear and present danger trees or killer trees should not be hand felled, and chainsaws falling these trees should be the last resort and avoided. During the falling, if it is happening, then the cutter should be looking up during the cutter and not relying on a spotter. This became an issue in this incident, and candling trees generally collapse rather than fall, and that they're the ones that we really should be walking away from, I guess. The corollary of that is that those dead spars that are smouldering at ground level tend to fall in a rotating action rather than collapse, and they're a significant risk. As I mentioned before, we are revising our procedures to align with the AFAC guidelines, and we've just seen the discussion on that. Our current procedures do closely align with it, but not in the language and the symbology. So that's one of the areas we need to change. This incident occurred in July last year up at Urimbula. It was a planned burn. You can see the highlighted burn area there. It occurred on the northern boundary. The burn happened under very good conditions. The Keach-Byron drought index was 79. The fire danger index on the day was about 5 moderate, I believe. There was good boundaries prepared. There was 2 days of prep work done around the boundary prior to the burn. So the burn was, in terms of the burn itself, well conducted. There's the northern boundary of the burn, where the incident occurred. There were no real exposures on this section, on this sector. The terrain was easy, and so that's where the incident occurred. I want to acknowledge Trevor Brighton's photos here. They're quite remarkable photos, which is why this could be a useful case study for this sort of discussion and training. This is prior to the tree fall. It illustrates the boundary that they were working on. The tree in question is arrowed there. It's in behind that foliage, and the vehicle was parked just in case any member of the public or somebody was going to run through there. So the the person there was really spotting for traffic, not spotting on behalf of the cutter. This photo here it was taken a minute or so before the incident. It shows the injured person working at the base of the tree, and it shows the tree involved in fire. If you can just see it at the top of the tree, there is flame coming out of two large branches, and it was those branches that all collapsed at the same time onto the cutter, and the cutter was severely injured. The tree was about 14 metres from the boundary and about 11 metres high as an estimate. This was taken after the incident, soon after the incident. The tree itself was quite solid at the base there, but it later burnt away. There's a hollow inside there that was visible later. You can see the hollow at the stump, but the tree had nearly been finished in terms of cutting, and the wedges were being put in when the crown collapsed. And here's the tree after the extraction of the injured person, with the crown missing, so that the tree was later put on the ground, and it was able to be measured and that sort of thing. So that was what actually happened. There was a number of recommendations came out of the investigation. A lot of it was around. Sorry, I've just got to catch up with my notes here. Yeah, a lot of it was around refocusing on hazardous trees, on the fire operations, and ensuring there's good assessment of alternatives available. There was discussion around incident control or approval for falling, and if that is in fact considered, and there were in fact no alternatives, and it is essential, and there's a lot of ifs in that statement, then we would regard that as already a near hit. There was also discussion from this incident on other elements like emergency response planning, training for problem trees and spotter, and some PPE issues came out of it. The cutter was also badly burnt, as well as hit by the debris. So how might the AFAC guidelines apply to an incident like this to help reduce the likelihood of this sort of incident happening? This just reinforces what's already been said. During the pre-burn phase, these sorts of trees on the fire line, can they be removed? Or if they're significant, can they be protected? And there really should be a lot more focus on getting rid of these trees on fire lines. There's given their risk to firefighters. If they can be protected, or they need to be retained there, then we need to do that. There's also the possibility that sometimes, even if we do burn both sides of this road and use natural containment, this may be a public road that has to be reopened again fairly quickly. Therefore, cleaning up these sorts of roads for tree fall hazards needs to be done promptly. This is an example of cool edge ignition, where we're on the easy side and the smoke's going away from us. The fire is easily moving in, avoiding any strip lighting on this side of the fire. We spotlight to keep the fire intensity low, as you can see there, and follow as quickly as possible with blackout prior to those trees becoming an issue. That's that close support technique. During the blackout phase, we can't always prevent these things from occurring. If they do, we can block them off. This photo here is not of Urimbula, but it was a recent photo that came to me. We can block off that area, prevent patrolling, and let the tree come down. In this example here, the tree was collapsing and debris was falling over the containment line. That was allowed to burn out and develop some depth to it before that escape was put out, and that then removed the need for any further patrolling on this section. So that's what that's burnt out adjacent is all about. The photo on the left here is just an example of one of those really no-win situations. It's a tree on fire, and it also has a significantly unstable hanger sitting up there, balancing between two branches where the arrow is. Something like this is just no way of going anywhere near that, or even considering hand falling. So these are the sort of things we need to ensure they don't light, or they're dealt with some other way. And probably the key thing for us is to avoid this, what has been the previous trained and accepted practice of trying to get these things on the ground. Previously, the training was that you can't leave something like this standing, and the focus was how are we going to get it down through better cutting skills or that sort of thing. We've got to change that thinking completely. If it's not a light, we should lay it down. If it is a light, what are the other options available to us that don't involve hand falling? So that's basically all I have here. But just on this spotter point, I just finish off with this. It's an old slide that came from America. Quite a few years ago, there was talk about the technique of cutting a tree with an unstable crown or issues above you, and there was strong emphasis on the cutter doing their own looking up and living, rather than relying on a spotter to warn them of something falling. There was just no time for that spotter in this situation to give the cutter reasonable warning. So they were strongly advocating that this type of technique should not be used, and we've adopted that here. That if it is deemed that a cutter can safely cut a tree, but they do have to watch for an unstable crown. I'm not talking about a tree on fire, but it may be a spar with a whippy top on it. As the cutter is cutting, the cutter is looking up while he's cutting, and sees immediately if there's something starting to come down, and they know which direction to escape to avoid it. So that's all I've got. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Peter. I'm just going to unmute the line for some questions.
The conference is now in conversation mode. All participants are now unmuted.
Okay, does anyone have any questions for John, Rory or Peter?
Peter, it's John. in slide 10 of your presentation, there was a bloke standing next to that tree that was involved in the incident without a helmet on. Is he part of Parks and Wildlife, or is he an ambulance officer, or just wondering what his role was there?
Yeah, that was an ambulance officer who was there. I don't know whether the person had already been extracted. It was looked to be later on in the afternoon, but I believe that was one of the ambulance officers, and wasn't part of our crew.
Any further questions for our presenters? It's always good when there's no questions. If the presenters feel like they've covered off on their topic quite well. So if there are no questions, I will thank Peter and John and Rory for their time. It's always great to get operational staff to present these webinars, but it is a little bit difficult. So thank you everyone for attending today.